Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode with Dr. Randy and Cameron Bunch. It's kind of weird to talk about yourself in the third person or name yourself in the third person. I'm sure you're probably used to it because you normally have to introduce yourself, but it's kind of a weird feeling.
Different.
But welcome back. We're going to continue on with our series on apologetics. For those of you who may have missed last week, we kind of wrapped things up with talking about going into the 1800s. We had a number of different intellectual thinkers coming onto the scene at that point, and amongst those were a lot of anti-religious and very materialistic and secular worldviews and ideologies that kind of gave the groundwork for a lot of prominent thinking for today, and a lot of antagonistic arguments towards intelligent design. So coming on the scenes, we had the likes of Feuerbach, who was someone who was just very, I would say, I don't know if there's a difference between when someone's just academic versus anti-God, and he came across much more of an anti-God type of individual because his focus wasn't really on providing more, I would say, intellectual arguments, but he just seemed like that he took a very whatever chance he could to take a dig at Christianity, and he just saw it as a way to diminish ourselves and kind of give ourselves an out. But coming onto the scenes, a lot of people started liking his ideas and the way he thought, because it kind of pushed away from the religious framework that was really prominent in that time. And some of it was good and some of it wasn't. I think a lot of religious structures and authoritative groups during that time did some harm. And so there were some people that pushed against that negative influence that it had. And coming on the scenes, you had someone like Darwin, who really, he presented a different model than the church had for how the universe came about. And because of this, people didn't look to try and seek how these two ideas could come together, but how it gave them an out from believing in a God. And so you had Darwin coming in with this idea of origin of species, and that it wasn't like the 7-day creation presented in the Bible. And so because it didn't happen in 7 days, that must mean the Bible wasn't real. And that kind of promulgated that thinking and that line of thought. And people like Marx loved this. People like Freud loved this. And they definitely took up these ideas. Marx, with someone being another person who's just very anti-religion, and called it the opium of the masses, he very much pushed against this religious mindset and believed that the only real value of anything in the world was material items, whatever we could touch, feel. And that was our reality. That was what should be our driving force. What should be almost our God was what is the material world. And then Freud going on with thinking of, he saw religion as a neurosis, like that the only thing that differentiated people that continued to if they had a problem in their life, they went and prayed, they bowed at the altar, kept praying, they kept bowing, kept praying, hoping that something would be fixed. In the same way that he saw OCD people washing their hands even though they were clean, he's just like, they just keep washing it until the world's fixed. And so these ideas started just to seep into society and become the major framework for a lot of atheistic thinking today. And so that's kind of where we left off on the intellectual side. And we were going to start moving into more cosmological side of the argument. And so, as always, we'll start off with kind of a biblical basis for where we're heading, and then just start kind of get the conversation rolling.
Yeah, like you said, by the beginning of the 20th century, a materialistic framework and pretty much a materialistic comprehensive worldview had been established. As you said, Darwin gave the scientific basis for those that were looking for that. Marx and his cohorts gave more of a social and economic foundation for it. Freud gave more of a psychological foundation for it. So you kind of had the whole spectrum covered, from science to social issues to, like you said, a socioeconomic, political landscape. So it was very in vogue to secularists. Now, we're going to use a couple of words routinely that I think beg some definition, because particularly for those of us raised in church, if we hear the word materialism, we tend to think of somebody being materialistic, meaning that they're focused on, houses and money and cars and boats, and, they're very materialistic. They want things. And that's true. That's a problem. But that's not what we're talking about. When we use the word materialism, we're talking about a philosophy that fundamentally states, and it's important to say, It is a philosophy. It is not a scientific position. It is a philosophy. It's also known as philosophical naturalism. And basically it posits that the only things that are real are material realities. So everything you can see, feel, and touch. In fact, today it's even to the point where people don't talk about, people that hold a strict materialistic viewpoint don't talk about the mind. They talk about the brain. And they see the mind as merely a chemical extension of activity of the brain. In other words, there's nothing transcendent, nothing spiritual, nothing that you can't see, feel, and touch, crush down, put under a Bunsen burner. If it can't be reduced down to chemistry and physics, it doesn't exist. It's what we call reductionism. So that's the materialist worldview that is very prominent in the academy coming into the 20th century due to all of these characters. And as we said before, Cameron, that even goes back to the Enlightenment, where there was kind of a rebellion against the authority of the church, just saying, well, just take it from us. This is the way things happen. People begin to do more inquiry philosophically and other ways, and even scientifically, and began to look at other options for the narrative, kind of a pushback against the narrative of the Catholic Church, because a lot of people saw abuse and hypocrisy, and there were some of those things. There were some just criticisms there. So here we come into the 20th century, and we have pretty much firmly in place this materialistic negative and that, or a narrative, and that held true in the academy where cosmology was concerned. And again, we're not talking about cosmetology, getting our haircut. We're talking about the cosmos, the universe. How did it begin? That's the study of cosmology, the study of the universe and its origins. And so at that time, there was pretty much a prevailing feeling in the academy among the scientists in general that the universe is what we would call eternal and static, meaning that it had always been and that it had been fundamentally the same forever. It was eternal. So that provided a couple of advantages to the materialists too, because if the universe is eternal and we've been around for a long time, nature, then that gives evolution an incredibly long time to go from single cell simple organisms to the complex life forms we see today in human beings. And if you just, and we'll get into this when we talk about the fine tuning of the universe and biological systems, the intricacies and specified complexity of the living cell is incredible, far more than what Darwin could have seen in his day. But to get from one extreme to the other, you got to have a lot of time. And so they love the idea of an eternal static universe. And of course, the Earth being around for a long time, because it allowed Darwinian evolution to have its day. It allowed it to solve, you can almost, it's kind of like the universal solvent. If time fixes everything. If you just got enough time, it's possible. So that was kind of their answer. But then in 1915, a German physicist that we're all familiar with really weird hair by the name of Albert Einstein came up with a theory of general relativity. That was around 1915. Before that, he had the theory of special relativity, and that had to do with time, and time being different, determined by the point of the observer. I don't want to get too much into the science because it bends my head into a pretzel, and I think if we just kind of give some general answers, it'll help carry the narrative without having to get too specific. But anyway, the theory of general relativity was a new theory on gravity. Whereas Newton said that, spatial bodies, planetary bodies had an attractive force to one another. And that was the Newtonian, theory of gravity. That held sway for a long time. Newton was brilliant. And some of his theory is certainly solid and still holds today. But that was his idea of gravity, that objects have a gravitational force and they attract one another. Einstein took a new look at this, and of course his theory was eventually proven to be true, and it's still the working theory today. But his theory was that massive objects, planets, stars, whatever, actually curved space, or what we now know as space-time. And there's kind of an axiom they would say that matter tells gravity how to curve, gravity tells objects how to move. So imagine, if you will, a sheet held at the four corners by four individuals, and you put a bowling ball or a softball or anything that's got a little bit of mass, a little bit of weight. It's going to bend that fabric, right? And it's going to move according to the channel of that curvature. And fundamentally, that's what Einstein discovered, is this is what large bodied objects are doing to space. They're curving space-time, and then space-time is determining how these objects move. That's his theory of gravity. But there were certain implications that disturbed Einstein. Einstein was a creature of his day. He carried the same philosophical biases of most of the people of his day. Static eternal universe makes everything work really well. Let's not rock the ship. So he wasn't trying to be controversial in any way. But the problem was, and there's way more science behind this. Neither you or I are scientists, so we're giving the narrative as we understand it, having listened to hundreds of hours of people in the know talk about this stuff. So we're giving kind of the popularized version of this to give people a general understanding of what is involved here. And it's important people understand this, because today, the things we're going to be talking about is now the narrative that we understand concerning the universe. And it has very strong theistic implications, which is very important for our discussion today. So what Einstein began to realize is that his theory actually implied not a static universe, but a dynamic universe, one that could either expand or contract. In fact, he realized that gravity, without a countermanding force, would basically cause all matter to come together until it finally was just all bunched together or grouped together, or congealed together into a solid single mass. And so, since we don't live in a universe like that, he posited and wrote about this. He posited what he called a cosmological constant. Now, there is a cosmological constant, and we'll come back to that again when we talk about fine tuning. But the idea was the cosmological constant was this countermanding force that pushed against gravity, allowing the universe to stay static. And of course, we know there is an expulsory force. There is a force that causes the universe to expand against gravity that we'll talk about. It's the energy density of space. We'll get to that when we talk about fine tuning. The problem was, it wasn't that Einstein posited this energy that caused space to expand. The problem was he assigned that force an arbitrary figure that would be equal to the attractive force of gravity. You let me know, Cameron, if any of this is getting too technical. But so basically what he did was he selected an arbitrary number so that they would basically cancel each other out, and you could still have the static universe. So that made him happy. That made the rest of the scientific community happy. Okay, good. We get to still have our static. Newton had run into the same problem, but he had fixed it a different way. That Einstein realized we can't use that today. That old model won't work for today. So we have to have another reason. So this is what it is. This cosmological constant working against gravity, gravity working against it, maintain this static, stationary, eternal universe. The problem was Einstein wasn't the only person who had, his hat in the game. There were other scientists that were also solving Einstein's field equations. Let me just say this about Einstein's theory. There was a Quaker Christian by the name of Sir Arthur Eddington, who headed up, I think it was astronomy at Cambridge, who confirmed Einstein's theory. He went to, I want to say it was the bottom of South Africa, turning a solar eclipse, and confirmed that the gravity of the sun indeed made light from distant stars bend. And for a lot of reasons we couldn't even begin to go into, that confirmed Einstein's theory of general relativity. And that exploded not only Eddington into the public eye, but made Einstein, of course, maybe the most famous scientist that has ever lived. And so people are now working off his equations. And what they began to discover is that Einstein's initial assumption that I don't know that he ever let that cat out of the bag about the dynamic universe, but people began to discover this on their own. First of all, there was several that did this. Probably the two most famous was a Russian mathematician by the name of Alexander Friedmann. And Friedmann solved Einstein's field equations, and he only went so far as to suggest that Einstein's equations work perfectly fine with the dynamic universe. He did not try to say whether it was expanding or contracting or staying the same. He just simply said, hey, it works just fine with an expanding universe. So, we don't have to just necessarily say it's static. But then some years, Einstein resisted that. He believed the guy's math was right, but he hated his physics because, again, he's got his own philosophical bias, toward materialism. But then there was a Catholic Belgian priest and astronomer by the name of Georges Lemaitre. And he's really the one who developed the model that we know of today as being the Big Bang. And he did the same thing Friedmann did. He worked out the field equations of Einstein's theory, but he also incorporated some new information that had begun to come out of the scientific community regarding what's called the red shift. Now, Einstein's theory was just that. It's a mathematical equation. It's a mathematical construct or theory. But what began to happen is a number of scientists, the most famous being Edwin Hubble, began to recognize that the galaxies, in fact, it's interesting. Let me just stop and say this. Until the 1920s, we did not even know there were galaxies. We did not know whether there were a lot of galaxies or just our galaxy, because what they were seeing through their telescopes, assuming they were just nebulae, were actually galaxies far, far away. But we did not know that. We didn't have the ability to determine the distances. Edwin Hubble was basically the one who determined the measurements of some of these, what we thought were nebulae, and determined they were actually galaxies in their own right. Today, we know there are hundreds of billions of galaxies, at least as large, if not larger than the Milky Way. Hundreds of billions. It's hard to wrap our mind around that. And, we're talking about numbers that are so ridiculously vast. The nearest star to us is about 24 trillion miles away. That's the nearest star to us. If you were to launch yourself like a rocket from the Earth and travel through space, the chances of you ever hitting anything are minuscule. Whole galaxies could pass through one another and never touch each other. Nothing touched from those two galaxies. That's how vast the distances we are talking about. It takes 8 minutes from the light of our sun to get to us. I mean, we're talking about numbers so incredibly huge, it's unfathomable. But we began to realize there's all these other galaxies out there. And what Edwin Hubble began to realize is that the light emanating from those galaxies is shifted to the red. It's known as the red shift. It's similar to the Doppler effect. If you ever hear a siren coming at you, as it's approaching you, it gets higher in pitch, da 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 da. And then as it goes away, da 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 da. That's the Doppler effect, and it has to do with the waveforms of sound. The same thing is true in visual phenomena, or like the color scheme, in the color spectrum. So anything shifted to the red, that's a long waveform. It means it's moving away from us. And so what Hubble and others realized is that these galaxies are actually moving away from us, and not just moving away from us, but at incredible speeds. And the interesting thing is they realize these galaxies are not moving away through empty space, but that the fabric of space itself is being stretched, being expanded. So we live in an expanding universe. The best analogy that I think paints the picture well is if you were to put dots on a balloon. When that balloon is deflated, those dots might be next to each other. Imagine that those are the galaxies. But as you begin to blow on that balloon, the dots don't move per se, but as the balloon expands, those dots get further away from one another. That's what they were discovering. And so Einstein was still very resistant to this whole idea of an expanding universe, but George Lemaitre, actually, there was a famous cab ride where he kind of let him know, hey, listen, we're on to you. This arbitrary number that you fixed to maintain your static universe, that doesn't work. Even if you use your value, inconsistencies in like the distribution of mass and energy would cause the universe to be dynamic anyway. So long story short, the jig was up. And Lemaitre and Arthur Eddington let Einstein know about what Edwin Hubble had discovered at his Mount Wilson telescope, the giant 100-inch telescope in Pasadena on Mount Wilson. So Einstein goes there. There's a famous picture of him looking through Edwin Hubble's telescope while Edwin Hubble's there with his pipe, looking all academic. And he comes out, Einstein does, and says, I now understand the necessity for an expanding universe. And so the cat's out of the bag. And this, as you can imagine, hit the scientific community like a thunderclap because of the theistic implications involved with that. But before I get into that, I'm going to stop and just say, is there anything, because I'm just telling this narrative, so is there anything you want to jump in there with Cameron and share?
No, I'm good. I mean, I'm along for this ride.
Okay, so why is that such a big deal that we have this expanding universe? Because as the universe is expanding through time, the obvious question to ask is, well, what happened then in the distant past? If we reverse engineer this and go back into the past, that means the universe is shrinking down. And that's exactly what the math and the science was telling all these guys. In fact, even Sir Arthur Eddington, who from what I understand is a Quaker believer, said something to this effect. He said, the idea of a beginning to the present order is repugnant to me. I should genuinely like to find a loophole. This was so ingrained into the scientific community that the universe was static and eternal that this upended everything. And many people resisted it for a long time. Long story short, if you reverse engineer the expanding universe, what do you have? You have the galaxies and all matter coming closer and closer and closer and closer together until eventually it goes all the way down to what we know as a singularity. Now, in the 1960s, a famous scientist, maybe the only scientist that rivals Einstein's fame, would be Stephen Hawking. Stephen Hawking is known from the movie that was done about his life not that long ago called The Theory of Everything. He's the scientist who spent much of his life in the wheelchair suffering from ALS, brilliant physicist. And he and Roger Penrose, who actually was one of the, I don't know what you call him, when Hawking did his doctorate degree, he was one of the moderators, I guess you would say, or whatever. But they began working together with another guy named, I think it was George Evans out of Australia. And they began to, again, solve Einstein's field equations to a much more sophisticated degree than Lemaitre and these other guys had done. And what they began to realize as they did the math is that if you reverse engineer Einstein's theory of general relativity and the physical evidence we have of the universe expanding, then space begins to curve into itself all the way down until it reaches a point of zero spatial volume. Now, if that sounds weird, it should, because how much stuff can you fit in zero space? Nothing. So they're literally saying that the universe and space and time curled down into a point of nothingness. It's what Lemaitre called a primeval atom or a cosmic egg. And they realized that out of this nothingness, if you will, this point of zero spatial volume, everything that is came into being. That's what the science, that's not believers, that's what the science said. Now, obviously, they did not like, those particularly that were materialists didn't like that, because what does that smack of? A creation event. In the beginning, the Bible presupposed a beginning. Robert Jastrow said it kind of humorously at the end of his book. He was a famous astronomer and not a Christian, but he said, for the scientist who spent all his life, studying, science support, it ends like a bad dream. He's scaled the mountain of ignorance. He's about to pull himself over the last ledge, only to find a group of theologians who've been sitting there for centuries. And so the theistic implications of that were obvious. And it's interesting because Hawking, who, as far as we know, died an agnostic or an atheist, even said, he made several statements about God, this kind of revealing or seeming to declare the reality of God in his book called A Short History of Time. Later, he kind of went against that and basically just said, well, because there's a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself out of nothing, which is absolute hogwash, but I'll get to that later. Anyway, the science was pointing to the reality of a Big Bang. But there were still a few confirmations to be made. And one was this, that somebody posited, one scientist realized, well, if there was indeed this enormous release of energy at the beginning of our universe that created everything, the Big Bang, by the way, was a derogatory term. It was a pejorative term given to it by an astronomer named Fred Hoyle, who later became Sir Fred Hoyle. And he was trying to use that as like, how ridiculous, like the whole universe came out of some Big Bang, and it stuck. But the idea is that if this huge, tremendous amount of energy was released at the beginning, then there has to be some kind of heat signature left over by that. Even though it's been distributed over these, hundreds of billions of light years of space, it should still be measurable. Well, sure enough, in the 1960s, Arno Penzias, who worked for Bell Labs, at the telephone labs at Bell Labs, he and a colleague of his were noticing that on their radar antennas or whatever they are, they're, I don't know if it's, I don't know what the radio antennas, that there was this low hum, this hiss that they could not get rid of. They even thought it might be pigeon droppings. They thought, maybe maybe the rivets aren't, welded down well. So they went through all this, but they couldn't get rid of this low hissing. And they found out that it wasn't just them. Everybody was experiencing this low hiss. And at that time, somebody had written a paper about this cosmic radiation, and they began to put two and two together and realize, I think what we're hearing is this, what's known as the microwave background, this microwave radiation that is a leftover of the Big Bang, the signature of heat. And they were able to put an actual measure to it. They ended up winning the Nobel Prize for their discovery. And indeed, they had found the microwave radiation background of the Big Bang. And then later, the Kobe satellite was released, and they were actually able to see it in a way. They were able to measure its waveform, and it basically was the portcullis fell on any other theory. Fred Hoyle and others had posited what they called a steady state theory that was a way to try to avoid a beginning, but basically they all failed. And once the background radiation was discovered and confirmed by the Kobe satellite, from that day to this, it is basically the scientific paradigm that we understand regarding the beginning of the universe. So what is the big deal? Well, here's the big deal. Given what we've said, what we know from science, this is not, Bible scholars saying this. This is the best of the science as we know it today. That at the what we call the singularity, the moment of the Big Bang, all matter, energy, space, and time came into existence in a tremendous release of energy. The problem with that is that if matter, energy, space, and time came into existence, then matter, energy, space, or time cannot be used as a cause for the creation event. That would be what we call cosmic bootstrapping. In other words, if X created Y, X had to precede Y, right? So that means that whatever the first cause was, the initial cause of our universe was, it had to be immaterial, because all matter came into existence at the time of the Big Bang. It had to have its own tremendous energy source, because all energy came into being at the point of the Big Bang. It also had to transcend space-time, time and space. So what does that sound like? Immaterial, ultimately powerful, transcending our space-time continuum. Sounds a lot like God. God is a spirit. He's eternal. He's omniscient. He's omnipresent. He fits the bill. And of course, he's omnipotent. So it obviously had enormous theistic implications. And in fact, it's interesting. I've been doing a lot of study over the last few days, listening to a lot of different stuff. I emailed the Discovery Institute, and one of their PhD, one of their doctors there sent me a paper he had written on the fine tuning of the universe and some other things. But nevertheless, even then, there were scientists that were trying to say, this is just a theory being promoted by, these religionists, Of course it wasn't. These were, Einstein was no Christian. He wasn't a Christian the day he died. And he resisted the whole idea of the, expanding universe for as long as he could, but the science won out. And then of course, Stephen Hawking, to the day he died, we don't know that he had any theistic leanings. He did go to church occasionally, and he would say, well, I'm still searching. But these were not people that had any kind of committed, biblical worldview. These were people who were what we would call philosophical naturalists, materialists. But again, the evidence just said what it said. And so it pointed to a transcendent cause. Now, for the theists, we're kind of like, duh. This is what the Bible's been saying all the time, in the beginning. So the Bible presupposes a beginning. In fact, it's interesting because you really have kind of, I hate to say it this way, but just for simplicity's sake, two beginnings. The Bible said, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Then the next verse said, and the earth was without form and void. So we're talking about two different things. Verse 1 implies the beginning of everything. The idea of the heavens and the earth is really just a Hebrew idiom saying everything came into existence. But then obviously what you have is a formless earth, which of course, if you go back 4.5 billion years ago when the earth first formed, that's what you would have, right? So you see this, progressive creation event where first of all, the heavens and the earth came into being, and then the planets and the stars and so forth began to form as the universe began to cool down. And then of course, matter began to congeal, that kind of thing, heavy elements, which are necessary for intelligent life. All this kind of stuff began to come into being. And about 4.5 billion years ago, the earth came into existence. And then of course, over time, it became what it is today, a planet, the planet, and we'll get into that later, that can support intelligent life. And so these theistic implications were not lost on the scientists. And that has given rise to a bunch of theories that have attempted to try to find a loophole in this cosmic beginning.
So one of the points that you just brought up is the age of the Earth, for example, and that's something that for a long time was a huge issue with theists or anyone purporting intelligence design when they look towards the Bible, because you just said the age of the Earth being 4.5 billion years. So how would you say that a lot of, because as you and I both know, and we would probably agree, that we do think the Earth is more than just a couple thousand years old, but it is billions of years old. So how did you, asking in a way to bring about the conversation, how did this get reconciled, this issue of 7-day creation and the Earth being 4.5 billion years, because the timelines don't seem to add up?
Well, it's not reconciled, I would say. There's a lot of people that still have huge issues with this. There's a lot of people that are what we call early Earth creationists that believe the Earth is only several thousand years old. I don't know what their figure is exactly, but maybe they would say 10 to a little bit more thousand years old, because they look at the 7 days of creation as literal 24-hour periods of time. There's a lot of problems with that, both in the text of the scripture itself, as well as our understanding of cosmology. Now, I don't believe we use science to interpret the Bible, but I do think what we've tried to do, which is equally wrong, is use the Bible to understand science. There are certain scientific statements made in the scriptures that are accurate. In the beginning, God did indeed create the heavens and the earth, meaning that there was a cosmic beginning. That's a plain statement of truth that needs not a whole lot of definition. Well, it needs a lot, I guess, but you know what I'm saying, it does. And then, of course, the Bible also points to something that Stephen Hawking and Roger Penrose's theory also revealed, and that was this idea of zero spatial volume, meaning that there was no physical matter at some point in the distant past. Well, what does the Bible say? Hebrews 11:3 says, by faith we understand that the worlds were formed by the word of God, so that the things which are seen were not made of things which are visible. It's basically saying that something came out of nothing. That's what we call creation ex nihilo. God created the earth out of nothing. Not nothing, because God is not nothing, but nothing physical. All physical matter came into existence at the point of creation. That's one thing the Bible and science are both agreed on. So that has strong theistic implications. But then a lot of Christians get concerned, well, yeah, but you're saying that the universe is 13.8 billion years old and that the earth is 4.5 billion. Why do we know that? Because we can look, for example, geologically at the earth and see something about its age. And then we can look at how long it took the light from distant stars to arrive here. It took 13.8 billion years. So that's where we get the age of the universe. And people say, well, God could have made it look like that. Yeah, but then you're kind of saying God is fudging the data to create an untruth or an illusion of truth. And I have problems with that. I think that's a bigger problem than saying the universe is 13.8 billion years old. So where's the issue? Dr. John Lennox has written a book called 7 Days That Divide the World, or something like that. And he talks about and a lot of them point to this idea, the word day. What does that mean? Even in our language, we use the word day differently. Hey, the day's almost over. Got to go inside, getting dark, the day's almost over. Well, not technically, it a day, 24 hours. But then your mom might say, back in my day. So what does a day mean? It means three different things. It can mean daylight. It can mean a 24-hour period of time, or it can mean an era or an eon, like in the days of Copernicus or in the days of Galileo. So what does that mean? The day of the Lord. What is that? That's not a 24-hour period. And so the Hebrew word has that same kind of flexibility with it. And then if you're going to take a super hyper literal interpretation of Genesis chapter 1, then you got the sun and the moon coming in on day 4. So what were you judging those 24-hour time periods, right? In days 1, 2, and 3. So I don't have any issues whatsoever with creation being exactly as the Bible said it, where the days represent different time periods in which God created as the Bible says. And even if we look at, like, say, the Cambrian explosion, we see certain mammals, or not mammals, certain animals coming, their body types coming fully formed at a specific time in the Earth's history. So if you make those ages rather than 24-hour time periods, there's no conflict whatsoever with what science tells us about the age of the Earth. I do not believe Genesis was written in a form of Hebrew poetry that's different than anything else in the Bible as I understand it. You may be able to elaborate on a little bit of that.
Yeah, so this is actually something that I've talked with a lot of my friends about, because for those of you who don't know, my study in college was in history. It was my major was history. I had a minor in religion and a secondary minor in political science. So history, political science, religion. And when you look at the book of Genesis and the creation story, I think the biggest mistake that we can make is looking at the Bible as a textbook. When Moses was writing, he was not thinking, okay, And a couple thousand years, people are going to be sitting down and looking for this to explain the history, the origins of the universe. No, he's talking to a very specific group of people, a group of people that have just come out of Egypt and have been influenced by so many different religions and ideas of the earth being formed. And I mean, one of the most common that we are aware of today of gods out of Egypt was Ra, which was the sun god. And then you have a lot of Babylonian religions and a lot of Babylonian origin stories. And all these religions have been being mixed in with the Israelites and being told, this is how the world was created. These are the gods, these are the other gods. And so a lot of this ideas and practice were seeping into that culture. And so Moses sits down and writes, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And it's just like, wait. Okay, we heard about Ra, we heard about this guy, we heard about that guy, we heard about this strange person. Where are all these people? We were told that there's this deep chaos, this weird thing, and then this God came in and slayed the chaos. And it's like, no. In the beginning, God's spirit hovered over the deep, over the water, which was this symbolism to them at that time that was like, oh, so God came in and tamed this chaos. And then he created the sun and the moon. Wait. Those aren't other gods? No. They're just some thing that God created. And then he made the creatures. Wait, this God didn't make the creatures? No, that God isn't real. And so when you look at the book of Genesis and you look at the creation story, it is a beautiful telling, pretty much of God just squishing every other like religion and every other God and being like, oh, you think this is a God? No, God is greater and he made that. And it's this beautiful telling when you understand Egyptian religion and Babylonian religion and Sumerian religions. And you have a lot of early religions that came in and races that came in. You have the Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, Hittites, Assyrians, Chaldeans, Persians, and the Egyptians, and all of them at this early time, along with the Hebrews, they're all looking for this, how did the world come about? Because at some point, man started straying from God. And so Moses is sitting down and being like, let me tell you the story of how God created the earth. Let me tell you how creation turned against him, how he ended up putting his promise on this guy named Abraham, how his lineage is where you guys come from. And that is what Abraham is accomplishing out of Genesis, is the origin story. Exactly. And it wasn't meant to be a textbook.
Right. I think a couple of things too, we want to qualify for those that might be getting concerned. Number one, we are not saying that God did not literally create the heavens and the earth as he described. What we're saying is the depictions of the 7 creation days are not meant to be a scientific treatise on how God did it. So we're talking about 7 days, however you want to interpret that. You know, if you're a literal creationist and you think, okay, I believe there are 7 24-hour periods, I'm not going to fall out of fellowship with you. Believe what you want. It's not that crucial. The point is, Genesis is trying to say, as you said, that the narratives of the creation, that the gods were somehow part and parcel of the universe, is not true, that God is transcendent. And what's amazing is that's what science tells us, that there was a force outside of space and time that created physical matter, energy, space, and time. That's what the Bible was trying to get across to those ancient people. God's still trying to tell us that. Yeah. Hey, I'm out here. I did that. And so Genesis is a narrative they could relate to, and the book of nature in science is giving us this revelation of the same thing from a cosmological standpoint. But and so we believe, you and I believe, that Adam and Eve, we do not believe in theistic evolution. We do not believe that God used evolution to create Adam and Eve. We believe that Adam and Eve were a special creation of God, just like Genesis says. When did we get placed here? Well, you'd have to talk to paleontologists and different ones who look at that. But however many thousands upon thousands of years ago Adam and Eve began, they did indeed begin in a Garden of Eden, and original sin is a true narrative. But what we're saying is you can't treat Genesis like a science book. It's not trying to tell you 1, 2, 3, here's the science how God did it. Like we said, the sun and the moon seem to appear on the 4th day. All he's saying is that God created those. Those were not somehow, God is not somehow co-equal with them. They're not other gods. He created them. He is supreme. He is sovereign over all. That was the primary thrust of that narrative, to let them know, okay, so this is the God we're dealing with, the creator. And what you see a lot of time, the creator of heaven and earth, that this emphasis that he is transcendent. And there's all sorts of allusions to this through the scripture. When he talks about creation, when he gets old, you'll fold up the heavens like a garment. Well, you can't fold a tablecloth unless you're outside the tablecloth. If you're one and the same with the tablecloth, you can't fold it up. So God is outside the created order. Another thing that's amazing throughout the Psalms, I forget how many times it talks about how he stretches out the heavens, which is exactly what we find in cosmology, that our universe is still expanding. This expulsion force that is, overriding gravity, as it were. And Hubble's constant, or I think it's Hubble's law, basically says the longer it goes, the faster it goes, because as matter gets further and further away, the constraints on that cosmological constant, the energy density of space, is released to go more quickly. And so the Bible infers a lot of these things, but it's not a scientific book. But once you know the science, you can look and say, hey, the Bible alluded to that. Yeah. But the one thing the Bible does say straight up was that there was a cosmic beginning, that God was transcendent, and he created all that we see, feel, touch, and know. All that's within the space-time continuum, the matter, the energy, space and time, was created by a sovereign and eternal God. And this fits in really, really well with what we know from science.
And I think one of the important things to know is, do we believe that God is fully capable of creating the earth and everything in it and everyone in it in 7 literal days? Yeah. Do we think that it was necessary for him to do so? No. It's just a matter of, we see how science is explaining something, and we can see another way through which God worked, as he did it through a scientific way, as a way to unravel what he did, a beautiful exploration. And I mean, there's certain things that God definitely had to put here for us just to explore and look at. I mean, you look at dinosaurs, for example. Why were they put here? Well, it's a great thing to explore. It's a great thing to uncover. It's a great thing. There's so many things that we get to explore and search for and understand. And that's part of the beauty of creation. I mean, there are so many things in the ocean we still have yet to discover, so many species, so many types of plants, and just so many things. Why are they there? Well, it's the beauty of God to hide a thing and for man to uncover it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, in talking about all this stuff, what's amazing is we're still discovering stuff all the time. It's funny because the hubris of materialism is we've got this all figured out. We don't have, there's so much we don't know. And maybe when we talk about particularly the specified complexity of the cell and some of that stuff in our next lessons, we're going to talk about fine tuning of the universe next time, but then we're going to talk a little bit about the fine tuning and the specified complexity in living organisms. When you begin to look at this stuff, like you said, there's new species we're still discovering all the time. There's parts of the ocean we've never fathomed. There is so much yet to discover. And what's amazing is when you look at the fine tuning of the universe, the very atmosphere that allows us to live is the same atmosphere that creates clear skies so that we can observe the universe. And that's why, God said the heavens declare the glory of God. And again, they bear witness, they give testimony. God wanted us to search this stuff out. And so it's amazing that in the creation, as we said, there's a book of scripture that gives special revelation and understanding of God, but there's the book of nature that reveals him generally to all men. And like I said, there's an intuition in every child. When they look at a night sky, beautiful sunset or the starry host, they say, who put that there? And somehow there's this intuition in all of us. We know that there is a creator. Like I said, I think that has to be taught out of us. And it has been taught out of much of our society today through, again, those that hold to a firm scientific materialism. Another thing, Cameron, I think we need to say about this is that a lot of people think, yeah, you guys believe on the basis of faith. Science is on the basis of evidence. No. Any true faith is based on evidence. When Jesus rebuked the disciples who didn't believe he'd been raised from the dead, he rebuked them for not believing the testimony of those who had already seen him. He left physical evidence behind, the sheet that he was buried with. He'd even folded up the little face napkin that was on his face. The empty tomb, there was lots of evidence. Yeah. Over 500 people saw Jesus raised from the dead. We believe on the basis of evidence, historical, scientific, philosophical, certainly biblical. That's our primary form of evidence.
One of my favorite things about what you just mentioned is that God always leaves evidence. And because I'd get into this conversation with different people in college, that it would come to me because we had a couple of 2 well-known cults on the campus at University of Hawaii. And one of the things that they came to me and asked me is they were like, what is a good signifier to tell the difference between these cults? And in these ones in particular, they had a lot of prophets that discovered things in secret. And one of the things I mentioned was that whenever God does something big, he never hides it. There is always evidence. For example, looking even at Moses, when God set out the law for his people, he carved it into tablets and wrote it down so his people would see it. That is a very visual sign. When he came and brought a new law, he sent his son to die on a cross. It was a very visual evidence. When God does something, when he moves, he brings evidence. He brought the law, he brought the prophets, he brought judges. I mean, the judges brought down signs from heaven, worked miracles. When Jesus came, that was public. When the apostles and the disciples went out, they went out with power and with miracles. When Jesus went up to heaven, he said that we would receive an advocate, a helper for us that would contend. And so we see these signs, wonders, and miracles. There is evidence being presented. So faith isn't baseless or evidenceless.
And even in the New Testament, when Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 talks about how Jesus was seen over 500 brethren, that's an early church creed that they believe was probably created somewhere like months after the resurrection. And Paul quotes that creed in 1 Corinthians 15. And he mentions the fact that he was seen of above 500 brethren, the most of which are still alive today, though some have died. So there would have been plenty of people who could have said, hey, I was there. This guy's lying. What Paul's saying is not true. This was a contemporary event. When this happened, Paul told King Agrippa, listen, I know you know about this stuff. This was not done in a corner. So this was not something that, people say, well, the Bible was written a lot later and a lot of legend. No, we have the Gospels written within like around, what is it? AD, help me with the numbers, around, is it 50? No, Paul's letters around 50 to 60 AD, which would have been like 20 years after. And then the Gospels are written a little bit later, but all within the lifetimes of that generation, these books were written. The last being John's writings, around, what, AD 90 or something like that.
I think 90.
Yeah, 90 to 100. So all within the lifetime of that first generation. So this stuff was around. The testimony of those who saw it, they were around. The people that saw the miracles, they were around. So this could be cross-checked. This is stuff that had plausible deniability if it didn't happen. And so the evidence was there. This is why historians that go back, like Ali Strobel, who was a legal editor for the Chicago Tribune, why J. Warner Wallace, a cold case detective, these were hard-boiled atheists who went and examined the evidence, cosmology, history, archaeology, paleontology, and came away saying, you know what? This Bible's true. It bears up. Now, here's the thing. I mentioned what I said a while ago because I wanted to say this, that when we're talking about the evidence, scientists are not above having their own biases based on their particular philosophy or worldview. So if, we've said this again, I think each time, that if you torture the data long enough, it'll tell you what you want to hear. I was listening to a Science Today trying to refute the fine tuning of the universe, which was maybe one of the best evidences of a designer. And when I listened to his argument, to me, it was the most ridiculous, convoluted mess that I'd ever heard. But it made sense to him because it gives him wiggle room out of a designer. So, again, if you don't want to hear something or believe something, you can kind of do the la, 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 I'm not listening to you kind of thing. And you may not do that literally, but you can do that emotionally or mentally and just filter out the evidence you don't want to hear. But I think, what's amazing is there are a lot of honest and objective scientists who stood it on the opposite side of the aisle. They were not theists. They were not men of God, and yet came to believe eventually because of the evidence in the fact that there was some intelligence that had to be behind this for it to be created the way that it was. And of course, we're kind of edging over into the fine-tune argument that we want to talk about next week. But again, the evidence for a creator, or at least for an event, a creation event, or what scientists would call a singularity, is there. It's on the books. And like I said, there are attempts to try to avoid that. There is what's known as the theory of the oscillating universe, which has long since been kind of died out. And that theory said, well, the universe expands and contracts and expands and contracts. We know that can't be true because of entropy. The universe only has so much energy. And so if it expands and contracts, it can only do that so many times, and it's going to be less and less until finally the universe dies a heat death. That's another reason why, by the way, the universe can't be eternal, because there's only so much energy in the universe. So if it was eternally old, it would have eternally, some time ago, burned all its fuel out. Well, our sun's still going, and the stars in the heavens are still going. The lights are still on. So entropy has not taken out all the fuel yet, although it's a dying universe, right? If there's not something to create more energy, it's eventually going to die, which is what entropy teaches us. There's always a loss for every action or activity. And then where was I going with that? Anyway, lots of evidence. So, you know, the other was the multiverse. That's the newest thing as well. There's been a multiple amount of universes, and so we just happen to live in the lucky one. And when we get into fine tuning, we'll talk about some of that stuff. But the fact, and all of these are an attempt to try to get away from that cosmic beginning. The new sexiest thing in the scientific community is what they call quantum cosmology. And I want to at least close my little part of this by saying this, that when Stephen Hawking was pressed for an answer to the beginning, because he even alluded, like I said, to this sounds a lot like a creation event in his book, A Brief History of Time. But later he made this statement. He said, because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself out of nothing. Now, if you just hear that statement from somebody who's really super smart, like he indeed was, then, you know, you can kind of, oh, well, he knows what he's talking about, surely. But that is a statement of utter nonsense. Laws don't bring anything into existence. All they do is describe the motion or the activity or the phenomena of a physical reality already present. So a law of gravity doesn't, put it this way, a law of gravity doesn't create a universe any more than figures in a checkbook put money in your account. It just doesn't work like that. And so the philosophers jumped all over Hawking when he said that, because that's what's called a category error. And the problem is a lot of scientists, because they're not trained in philosophy to think this thing through and all of its implications, they'll make mistakes on the basis of their biases like anybody else can. But if you think through it logically, that's why philosophers of science are so important, because they help to think through the implications of these laws and the understanding that we get from science to kind of get out some reasonable scenarios of what could and could not have happened. And so, yeah, just saying that the biases are there with scientists, no matter how smart they are. It's like John Lennox said, foolishness is foolishness, even when scientists say it. And so, you know.
Well, we are just about at the end of our time. It is 6:52. So as we mentioned, next week, we will be getting into the fine-tuning argument, which if those of you who have no idea what it is, we've mentioned in the past this guy named Christopher Hitchin, who was known as one of the 4 chief people for the Voice of Atheism. And he said about the fine-tuning argument that it was a reasonable argument against his position. So for an argument for creation, for God, it is a very powerful and very interesting one to learn about. So please definitely join us next week as we're going to discuss that. And as always, we'd love to hear any questions you might be having as we're proceeding in this discussion. We know that some of the conversations, some of the issues can get very heady or very complex, and we are trying to make it at a much more approachable, popular level versus having you have to read such convoluted ideas and books. But if you are interested, we can always reference different materials or recommend different books. But we are going to get into the fine-tuning argument next week, and we'd love for you to join us. For now, we are going to close in prayer. So, Dad, would you like to close?
Yeah, you know, if you're listening to this and you know, your heart is stirred, let me just say this. There was a brilliant scientist. I don't think he's living any longer. His name was Alan Sandage. He's called the grand old father of astronomy. He was actually the heir, if you will, of Edwin Hubble. Took over his work after Edwin Hubble died, from whom the Hubble Space Telescope is named. Alan Sandage is probably the chief in his field of science, and he became a believer based on the evidence. So don't ever allow anyone to make you feel like, well, if I believe in Jesus, I'm going to come across as somebody that's dumb. And I'm just taking a moment to say this, but not that long ago, I saw on Facebook, there was this thread where people were kind of mocking faith in Christ, that it's unintelligent, that it's unscientific. And I mentioned a handful of people. I mentioned John Lennox, Alan Sandage, Dean Kenyon, who is now the professor emeritus of I think it's physical biology. Anyway, all these, and he was a textbook writer for the materialist view of origins of life. He refuted his own book and has become a believer. So I'm saying there are Nobel laureates who are believers in Jesus Christ, that are born again, that look at the evidence and say it points to a transcendent creator. So don't let anyone intimidate you or back away from your faith or be ashamed of your faith because it's not intelligent. You hear that all the time. Bill Maher, all these other guys, Ricky, whatever that comedian, Gervais, thank you. All these guys are trying to make you feel like an idiot because you believe in Jesus. But the Bible said the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. And if I'm going to be on anyone's side, I'm going to be on God's side on this issue. Father, we pray for our friends watching the broadcast now. Open our minds and hearts to understand and receive the truth. Father, may we ever be seekers of truth. May we ever be those who desire to know what is real, what is right, what is true. We don't have to be afraid of truth, for you are the author of truth, and all true truth points to you. So open our hearts and minds that we may see it and know it and understand it. We give you thanks and praise for it, Father, in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Well, thanks again for joining us. Thanks, Cameron, for kind of hosting this. I appreciate you doing that. Appreciate your background, particularly in some of the historical issues and on some of the theological issues as well about Genesis and so forth. These are issues that are very heady, as you said, and we're trying to bring it on a popular level. So be with us next week. Again, we're going to get into the fine tuning, as Cameron said. It's going to be a lot of fun. So God bless you guys. We'll see you next week. All right. Bye-bye.